On November 17, 1968, the German-flagged freighter Stuursberg A slipped its moorings at the port of Antwerp, its diesel engine settling into a low, percussive rhythm against the grey waters of the Scheldt estuary. To the casual observer on the quay, it was an unremarkable vessel embarking on an equally unremarkable journey, one of thousands of such departures that stitched together the commercial fabric of post-war Europe. Its manifest listed a cargo of 200 tons of plumbat, a lead-based pigment compound, packaged in 560 steel drums and destined for the Secca Petrochemical Company in Genoa, Italy. Yet, the quiet woman who had overseen the final loading paperwork from a small, temporary office near the dock, her expression as neutral and unmemorable as her plain wool coat, knew the truth. The ship was not merely a ship, it was a ghost vessel, crewed by a covert team of Israeli naval operatives. The manifest was a lie, a meticulously crafted piece of fiction designed to satisfy the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the European Atomic Energy Community, or Euratom. And the cargo was not lead pigment, it was 200 tons of uranium oxide, yellowcake, the foundational material for a nuclear weapon, and it was not going to Italy. It was being stolen in plain sight, not through force of arms, but through the infinitely more powerful weapon of paperwork, and she, a daughter of a nation forged in the ashes of one Holocaust, was the architect of the heist that would ensure there would never be another. The strategic problem facing Israel in the mid-1960s was one of stark, existential mathematics. The nation had achieved a stunning tactical victory in the Six-Day War of 1967, but this victory had paradoxically deepened its strategic isolation. Surrounded by hostile states vowing its destruction, and with its primary military and political patron, France, suddenly turned cold under Charles de Gaulle, Israel found itself perilously alone. The French government, which had been the indispensable partner in the construction of the Negev Nuclear Research Center near Dimona, imposed a strict embargo, critically halting the supply of uranium needed to bring the reactor to full operational capacity. The Dimona facility was Israel's ultimate guarantee, the Samson option, a deterrent of last resort intended to make the cost of annihilating the Jewish state unacceptably high for its enemies. Yet, a reactor without fuel was merely a monument to a failed strategy. The Intelligence Directorate of Mossad, the Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, was therefore tasked with a mission of the highest national priority: acquire, by any means necessary, a sufficient quantity of uranium to fuel Dimona and produce the plutonium required for a credible nuclear arsenal. The urgency of this directive could not be overstated. It was perceived within the highest echelons of Israeli leadership as a direct race against time and annihilation. The failure of conventional methods had been swift and absolute, serving only to heighten the sense of desperation. Diplomatic overtures to other nuclear-capable nations were met with firm rejections, as no country was willing to openly violate the spirit, if not yet the letter, of the nascent non-proliferation movement for Israel's benefit. Attempts to procure the material on the open market were non-starters. The international trade in fissile materials was a tightly controlled ecosystem overseen by watchdog organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency and, within Europe, the formidable Euratom. Every gram of uranium was tracked from mine to mill to reactor through a scrupulous system of end-user certificates, export licenses, and physical inspections. Any attempt to purchase yellowcake through legitimate channels would have required Israel to declare its purpose, subjecting Dimona to the very international inspections it was designed to avoid. Covert, small-scale smuggling operations were considered and summarily dismissed as strategically insignificant. The Dimona reactor required tons of uranium, not kilograms. Smuggling such a quantity in piecemeal fashion would have created an impossibly large and complex network of operatives, increasing the risk of exposure exponentially with each small transaction. The target, therefore, was not a person or a facility that could be neutralized with a bullet or a bomb, it was the entire international regulatory apparatus itself. The challenge was to exploit a flaw in this bureaucratic fortress, to make a mountain of nuclear material disappear from under the noses of its guardians, and to do so in a way that was so clean, so utterly deniable, that the theft would look like nothing more than a shipping error or a case of corporate fraud. The entity at the heart of the operational challenge was not a hostile intelligence agency but the material itself, uranium oxide, U-308. Known colloquially as yellowcake for its distinctive color and texture, this processed uranium ore was the feedstock for the heavy water reactor at Dimona. Once irradiated within the reactor core, a portion of the uranium-238 isotopes would transmute into plutonium-239, the fissile material ideal for a compact and efficient nuclear warhead. The specific target for Mossad's acquisition plan was a stockpile held by a Belgian company, Société Générale de Minerais, SGM, a firm with a long and storied history of dealing in sensitive materials from its African mining concessions. The challenge was not in locating the material, but in devising a method to legally move it out of SGM's possession and into Israel's. The primary obstacle was Euratom, the multinational agency established by the Treaty of Rome to create a common market for nuclear materials among its member states. Euratom's regulations were designed with precisely the goal of preventing clandestine diversion. Any sale of nuclear material required the submission of a detailed purchase order, an export license from the source country's government, and, most critically, a verified end-user certificate, EUC, from the destination country, confirming the legitimate, peaceful purpose of the material. This paper trail was the system's central nervous system. Any anomaly, any mismatch in documentation, would trigger an immediate and thorough investigation. The operational environment was not a physical battle space but a bureaucratic one, a world of ledgers, shipping manifests, customs stamps, and corporate letterheads. To succeed, Mossad had to become masters of this world, creating a flawless illusion that could withstand the cold, impartial scrutiny of European regulators. The solution proposed by a select unit within Mossad was audacious in its simplicity and breathtaking in its scope. Codenamed Operation Plumbat, the plan was not to physically steal the uranium but to conjure it away through a perfectly executed act of corporate and logistical misdirection. The core concept was to create a phantom transaction. Mossad would establish a completely fictitious, but legally sound, front company in a Euratom member state. This company would then purchase the 200 tons of yellowcake from SGM in Belgium for a stated, legitimate purpose at a non-existent facility in another member state. The material would be loaded onto a chartered ship, and once the vessel was in international waters, it would disappear from the grid. It would rendezvous with an Israeli vessel, transfer its cargo at sea, and then sail to a different port under a new name and with a clean manifest, its original journey a ghost in the maritime record. The uranium would arrive in Israel, and the paper trail in Europe would lead investigators on a circular chase, ending at a company that no longer existed and a transaction that had never been real. It was a plan that relied not on explosives and stealth, but on corporate law, international maritime regulations, and the subtle art of forgery. The beauty of the proposal was its deniability. If anything went wrong, it would appear to be a case of commercial fraud, a matter for civilian police, not a state-sponsored act of nuclear proliferation. The obstacles to the success of Operation Plumbat were formidable, a cascading series of challenges where a single failure would compromise the entire endeavor. The primary technical and logistical hurdle was the at-sea transfer. Orchestrating a rendezvous between two freighters in the open Mediterranean, far from shipping lanes and prying eyes, and then transferring 560 heavy, awkward steel drums from one vessel to another, potentially in rough seas, was a complex naval operation fraught with risk. It required absolute control over both ships, crews loyal to the mission, and precise timing. The bureaucratic obstacles were even more daunting. Mossad had to create a front company, Asmara Chemi GmbH, in West Germany, that was more than just a name on a letterbox. It needed a physical address, functioning telephone lines, a registered corporate charter, and German bank accounts capable of handling the multi-million-dollar transaction. This entity then had to produce a series of forged documents of such high quality that they would pass muster with German export authorities, Belgian customs, and Euratom's notoriously meticulous inspectors. This included purchase orders, financial guarantees, and the linchpin of the entire deception, a forged end-user certificate from an Italian petrochemical company, Seca, which would be named as the recipient of the Plumbat for use as a catalyst. This required not just printing paper, but perfectly replicating the corporate letterhead, signature style, and bureaucratic phrasing of an Italian executive who had no knowledge of the transaction whatsoever. The risk of exposure was a constant, suffocating pressure. A curious bank teller in Hamburg, an overly diligent customs official in Antwerp, a random phone call to Seika in Italy to verify the order. Any one of these routine checks could unravel the entire conspiracy, exposing Israel's nuclear ambitions to the world and triggering a diplomatic firestorm of catastrophic proportions. The consequences of failure were not just the loss of the money and the material, but a potential strategic setback from which the nation might never recover. The technological and tactical preparation for Operation Plumbat was a masterclass in clandestine statecraft, a deep dive into the granular details that separate success from catastrophic failure. The first pillar of the operation was the creation of Asmara Chemi GmbH. This was not a task for spies in trench coats but for Mossad's specialized financial and legal operations division. Working through a trusted network of Cyanim, volunteer Jewish diaspora supporters, and established cutout agents, they legally registered the company in the commercial courts of Hamburg. An office was leased in a respectable business district, not a grand suite that would attract attention, but a modest space befitting a small, specialized chemical trading firm. Telephone and telex lines were installed and activated, ensuring that any verification calls from authorities would be answered professionally by a German-speaking operative trained for the role. Bank accounts were opened at the Deutsche Bank, and funds, laundered through a series of complex international transactions originating from shell corporations in Panama and Liechtenstein, were deposited to cover the cost of the uranium, demonstrating Asmara Chemi's financial legitimacy. The most painstaking work involved the creation of the corporate stationery. Mossad's Technical Services Division, known as Tsamit, sourced period-specific paper stock and used vintage German typewriters to produce letterheads, invoices, and purchase orders. They studied legitimate German corporate documents from the era, meticulously replicating the typography, ink saturation, and formal, stilted language of West German business correspondence. Every document produced was an artifact, a perfect imitation designed to blend seamlessly into the bureaucratic ecosystem. The second pillar was the vessel itself. The operation required a ship that was both unremarkable and completely controllable. After an extensive search of maritime listings, Mossad identified the Stuursberg A, an aging, 3,600-ton cargo ship built in 1955. It was perfect, small enough to be inconspicuous, large enough for the cargo, and old enough to be sold without raising eyebrows. Through a front company registered in Liberia, a flag of convenience notorious for its lax oversight, Mossad purchased the vessel. The existing German crew was dismissed and paid a generous severance. A new captain and a core group of officers were then installed, all of them were elite, hand-picked veterans of the Shayetet 13, Israel's naval commando unit. These men were not just sailors, they were trained operatives, skilled in navigation, engineering, and covert operations. They spent weeks familiarizing themselves with every inch of the ship, from its engine quirks to its structural groan in a heavy swell. Minor modifications were made below decks, including the installation of sophisticated, concealed long-range communication equipment that would allow the captain to remain in constant, secure contact with Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. The rest of the crew was hired from the usual pool of merchant mariners, men who would follow the captain's orders without question and who would have no knowledge of the ship's true ownership or the cargo's real nature. The ship's logbooks were prepared in advance, 2 sets of them. One detailed the legitimate voyage from Antwerp to Genoa, to be presented to any authorities who might board the vessel. The other, the true log, would be kept hidden, tracking the ship's actual course to its clandestine rendezvous point. The third and most delicate pillar was the paper trail, the web of lies that would legitimize the illegitimate. The creation of the forged end-user certificate from the Italian company, Seika, was the operation's most critical forgery. Mossad operatives in Milan conducted discreet surveillance of the Seika offices, obtaining samples of their corporate letterhead, likely through a covert black bag job or by cultivating a source within the company's mailroom. They studied the signature of the company's purchasing director, a man named Herbert Lamberti, until they could replicate it flawlessly. The text of the EUC was drafted in perfect, formal Italian, stating that Seika required the 200 tons of plumbat for use as a specialized catalyst in a new industrial process, a plausible, if slightly unusual, application that was just technical enough to discourage deep questioning from non-experts. The document was then artificially aged, given the subtle creases and faint discoloration of a paper that had been handled and filed. This single piece of paper was the key that would unlock the entire transaction. It was sent from the Italian company to Asmara Chemi in Hamburg. From there, the operative running the German front company submitted it, along with the purchase order and financial statements, to the West German authorities and, through them, to Uranium. The paperwork was reviewed, cross-referenced, and, finding no inconsistencies, approved. The trap was set. The bureaucratic system, designed to prevent nuclear proliferation, had been turned against itself. Its own rules and procedures were now being used to sanction and facilitate the very act it was meant to forbid. The operative selected to orchestrate this intricate deception from the ground in Hamburg was a woman whose personal history was indivisible from the mission's existential stakes. Born in the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp in 1946 to Holocaust survivors, her entire worldview had been shaped by the trauma of statelessness and the promise of Israel as a guarantor of never again. She was not a field operative in the traditional sense, she was not trained in weapons or hand-to-hand combat. Her recruitment by Mossad had been based on a different, rarer set of skills. She was a polyglot, fluent in German, English, French, Italian, and Hebrew, able to shift between languages and cultural nuances with seamless ease. She possessed a formidable intellect, with a mind that saw the world in systems and processes, and an almost pathological attention to detail. Most importantly, she had a unique psychological makeup forged in her upbringing, a capacity for profound compartmentalization, an ability to project an aura of quiet competence while masking a core of unwavering resolve, and an innate understanding of European bureaucracy. Her motivation was not abstract patriotism, it was a deeply personal, almost visceral conviction that the survival of her people depended on the success of her work. She was the ghost in the machine, the human element that would navigate the complexities of the plan with the cool precision of a surgeon. Her training was as unconventional as her role. She spent months at a Mossad training facility, but not on the firing range or the obstacle course. Her classrooms were mock offices and simulated corporate environments. She was drilled in the nuances of West German corporate law, international shipping finance, and the specific regulatory statutes of Uranium. Instructors, playing the roles of skeptical bankers, inquisitive customs agents, and suspicious port officials, subjected her to relentless psychological pressure, testing her ability to maintain her cover story under stress. They trained her in the subtle art of document analysis, teaching her to spot the minute flaws in forgeries so that she could ensure her own were perfect. She learned to use a typewriter not just to write, but to replicate the specific force and rhythm of another person's typing. Her psychological conditioning was equally intense. She underwent exercises designed to strengthen her ability to live a double life, to separate her operational persona from her true self so completely that even a lie detector might be fooled. The goal was to transform her into a living, breathing component of the operational infrastructure, an individual so deeply embedded in her legend that the role would become second nature. She was being prepared not for a brief, violent encounter, but for a long, quiet, and psychologically taxing performance where a single missed cue could bring the entire production crashing down. The construction of her cover identity, her legend, was an exercise in meticulous fiction. She was to be Clara Meitner, an executive assistant at Asmara Chemi GmbH. The name was chosen for its plausibly German sound and its lack of any connection to known intelligence assets. The legend was built outward from this core, layer by painstaking layer. A backstory was created, born in Stuttgart, educated in business administration, a history of employment at several now-defunct trading firms. This history was supported by a portfolio of forged documents, a birth certificate, university transcripts, letters of recommendation. Mossad established a physical footprint for her in Hamburg. A modest apartment was rented in her name in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. The apartment was furnished sparsely, reflecting the supposed tastes of a single, career-focused woman. Crucially, props were introduced to solidify the legend and provide a psychological buffer for the operative herself. She acquired a cat, a mundane detail that added a layer of domestic normality and provided a plausible excuse for her quiet, home-based lifestyle. She took up watercolor painting, attending a local evening class. This hobby served multiple purposes. It gave her a reason to be seen in the community, it provided a non-threatening topic of conversation if neighbors or colleagues became curious, and the act of painting itself served as a meditative release from the immense pressure of the operation. Her pattern of life was deliberately, monotonously regular. She commuted to the Asmara Chemi office each day, purchased groceries at the same local market, and rarely socialized. She was designed to be overlooked, to be the kind of person who leaves no lasting impression, a gray figure against a gray urban backdrop. Her insertion into Hamburg marked the beginning of the operation's most vulnerable phase. For months, she lived the life of Clara Meitner, a solitary existence defined by the rigid discipline of her cover. Her days were spent in the small Asmara Chemi office, methodically building the company's facade. She answered the phone, filed paperwork, and initiated the correspondence that would eventually lead to the uranium deal. Each action was deliberate, each word chosen with care. She conducted the initial negotiations with the Belgian supplier, SGM, via telex and formal letters, projecting an air of professional competence. She liaised with the shipping agent who chartered the Stuursberg A, haggling over prices and schedules with the practiced ease of an experienced logistics manager. She personally handled the submission of the forged Italian end-user certificate to the German authorities, her calm demeanor belying the adrenaline coursing through her system as the documents were scrutinized. Every interaction was a performance, a tightrope walk over a chasm of exposure. She lived in a state of constant, low-grade tension, knowing that the entire weight of Israel's most vital national security secret rested upon her ability to be utterly and completely boring. Her handlers in Tel Aviv communicated with her through coded messages embedded in innocuous business telexes and through brief, clandestine meetings with a case officer during business trips to other German cities. For the most part, however, she was alone, isolated within the fiction she had helped to create. The final weeks leading up to the shipment were a crucible of psychological pressure. The complex web of forged documents, front companies, and clandestine communications had to hold together under the final, intense scrutiny of the transaction's closing stages. The payment for the uranium, a sum of $37 million, was transferred from Asmara Chemi's Hamburg bank account to SGM in Belgium. The transfer was executed flawlessly, a massive sum moving between accounts without triggering any alarms, a testament to the meticulous financial groundwork laid by Mossad support teams. The final export licenses were granted by the West German government, their official stamps and seals providing the ultimate veneer of legitimacy. Clara Meitner received the final confirmation from the shipping agent. The Stuursberg A would dock in Antwerp on November 15, ready to begin loading. During this period, her communication with the hidden Mossad command crew aboard the vessel was indirect, filtered through the official shipping agent. She would pass on loading schedules and cargo specifications, and they would confirm receipt, a mundane exchange that cloaked the final, critical coordination of the covert operation. The waiting was the hardest part. She spent her evenings in her quiet apartment, painting watercolors of the Hamburg canals, the steady motion of the brush of fragile defense against the storm of anxieties. A single phone call from a German regulator to the SECA office in Italy, a routine verification that had somehow been overlooked, was all it would take to bring everything crashing down. On the morning of November 16, the loading process began at the port of Antwerp. Clara Meitner was present, standing on the docks, a clipboard in her hand and a hard hat on her head. She played her part to perfection, observing the proceedings with a detached, professional air. She watched as the port cranes lifted the 560 steel drums from the wharf and lowered them one by one into the hold of the Stuursberg A. Each drum was painted a dull industrial gray and stenciled with the word Plumbat and the logo of the fictitious German chemical company. To the Belgian longshoremen and the port officials overseeing the process, it was just another shipment of industrial chemicals. For the operative, each drum that disappeared into the dark hold of the ship was a measure of success, another step towards the fulfillment of her mission. She conferred briefly with the ship's captain, the Shayatet 13 commander playing the role of a German merchant sailor. They exchanged pleasantries and signed the final cargo manifests, a moment of profound, unspoken understanding passing between the two key figures of the operation. Her mind was a whirlwind of contingency plans and abort signals, but her face was a mask of placid bureaucracy. As the final drum was secured and the hatch covers were sealed, her role in the physical execution of the plan was complete. She watched the Stuursberge pull away from the dock the next day, a silent, gray ship carrying a nation's future in its belly, and then she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the city. The climax of Operation Plumbat was not an explosion or a firefight, but an act of maritime legerdemain performed in the vast, empty silence of the open sea. After clearing the Strait of Gibraltar, the Stuursberge deviated from its declared course to Genoa. The captain ordered the ship's radio silenced and its AIS transponder, the device that broadcast its position to other vessels and shore stations, deactivated. Under the cover of darkness, it sailed to a prearranged rendezvous point in the eastern Mediterranean, between Crete and Cyprus. There, it met its ghost, the Israeli freighter Arad, which had sailed from Haifa under a similar cloak of electronic silence. The sea was calm, a stroke of operational luck. For 10 tense hours, the two ships sailed side by side, lines holding them together as naval commandos supervised the perilous ship-to-ship transfer. Using the ship's own cranes, the 560 drums, each weighing over 700 pounds, were carefully hoisted from the hold of the Stuursberge, swung across the gap of churning water, and lowered into the hold of the Arad. It was a slow, grueling process, every movement fraught with the risk of a dropped drum, which would have meant the irretrievable loss of precious cargo and a potential radioactive spill. By dawn, the transfer was complete. The Stuursberge was empty, its hold smelling faintly of industrial paint. The two ships separated, the Arad setting a direct course for a military-controlled dock at the port of Haifa, its cargo now officially an Israeli state secret. The operation's central act, the physical acquisition, was over. The final stages of the plan were executed with the same clinical precision. The Mossad crew of the Stuursberge doctored the ship's logbook, creating a fictional account of its journey. They sailed the now empty vessel to the port of Iskenderun, Turkey. There, under the cover of a routine crew change, the Israeli operatives disembarked one by one, melting away into the port city before traveling overland to safe houses and eventual extraction back to Israel. A new, legitimate merchant crew, hired by the Liberian Front Company, came aboard. They were given the doctored logbooks and a new set of orders. The ship was renamed, its hull repainted, and its registration changed. The Stuursberge had effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a new vessel with a clean history. Simultaneously, in Hamburg, the operative executed her own quiet escape. With the ship's departure confirmed, she began to methodically erase Clara Meitner. She terminated the lease on the apartment and the office, paid all outstanding bills in cash, closed the Asmara Chemi bank account, and destroyed every piece of incriminating paperwork. Her cat was left with a note and a generous amount of money for a neighbor who had previously expressed admiration for it. She then took a train from Hamburg to Zurich, a routine business trip, and from there, using a different passport with a different name, she boarded a flight to Tel Aviv. Like the ship she had chartered, she simply vanished. The fallout in Europe unfolded in bureaucratic slow motion, exactly as planned. Weeks turned into months. The Italian company, Seca, having never received its expected shipment of Plumbat, eventually filed a query. This triggered a low-priority investigation by Uranium inspectors. They began to trace the paper trail. In Belgium, SGM confirmed they had sold the material and seen it loaded onto the Stuursberge. In Germany, investigators found that the purchasing company, Asmara Chemi GmbH, had been legally registered but was now defunct, its office empty, its principals having disappeared. The German bank confirmed the transaction had been legitimate. The ship itself was gone, its records showing it had been sold and renamed. The crew, when questioned months later, reported that the charterer had ordered them to transfer the cargo to another ship at sea, a strange but not unheard of practice in maritime commerce. Every lead was a dead end. There was no evidence of theft in the traditional sense, the material had been duly purchased and paid for. It was a perfect puzzle with no solution. The official Uranium conclusion, reached years later, was that the 200 tons of uranium had been lost at sea, a euphemism for a mystery they could not solve. The sheer audacity of the operation had been its greatest offense. No one in the European regulatory community could conceive of a state-sponsored plot on such a scale, so the investigation defaulted to the most plausible explanation, a sophisticated case of commercial fraud. The 200 tons of yellowcake, meanwhile, were being processed at Dimona, the foundational material for the nuclear deterrent that would reshape the strategic balance of the Middle East forever. The long-term strategic value of the intelligence gathered was immeasurable, it was a guarantee of survival. The political and diplomatic repercussions were, by design, non-existent. For the operative, the return was not to a hero's welcome but to a quiet debriefing in a sterile Mossad facility. Her mission was a success of historic proportions, yet it could never be acknowledged. The identity of Clara Meitner, which she had inhabited so completely for nearly a year, was stripped away, filed in a folder that would be locked in a vault, never to be seen again. She had been transformed by the mission, her life permanently altered. The intense focus and compartmentalization required to live the legend had left an indelible mark on her psyche. She had spent months being someone else, and the return to her own identity felt jarring, incomplete. She had secured the future of her nation by becoming a ghost, a non-person whose greatest achievement was to be utterly forgettable. This was the profound psychological cost of her service, a sense of deep, abiding isolation, the burden of a secret that defined her existence but could never be shared. She had looked into the abyss of her people's potential destruction and had done what she believed necessary to prevent it, but in doing so, she had sacrificed a part of her own humanity, forever separating herself from the world she had fought to protect. The operation raised profound moral questions that would echo through the decades. Did the existential threat faced by a nation born from genocide justify an act of such profound international deception, an act that shattered treaties and set a dangerous precedent for nuclear proliferation? Israel's answer was written in the quiet, humming core of the Dimona reactor, a silent testament to the belief that when survival is at stake, the normal rules of the world cease to apply. Did the existential threat faced by Israel justify an operation that circumvented international nuclear safeguards? What precedent does such an action set for other nations who may feel their survival is on the line? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.